All right, welcome everyone. I'm Paul Edwards. I'm the co-director of the Stanford Existential Risks Initiative, and it is such a pleasure to welcome all of you today. I'm going to speak very briefly, and then we will have our first panel. I wanted to talk a little bit about what SERI is. So we have been around since really 2019, when my co-director Steve Luby and I started a class for freshmen on preventing human extinction. We are in the, sixth round of that right now. It's been a transformative course for many of those students. And part of the reason we wanted to do that was to kind of guide students into pathways where they can make a difference on any of the existential risks in the rest of their college careers and in their lives. So the approach that we have taken at SERI, which is different from that at some of the other existential risks centers, is to really focus mainly on the near and medium term, on risks that can be analyzed with empirical data and with some hope of predicting what might happen. So maybe the longest term risk you could think of in that way is sea level rise over the next 300 years or so. We can predict that pretty well. And we've also really stressed scholarship and teaching support. So we offer summer fellowships for undergrads, 2-year postdoctoral teaching fellowships, and we have our first panel will be moderated by an alumnus of that program, Dan Zimmer, and also conferences like this one. So what's existential risk? The first thing I want to say about this is that this term is used colloquially in many different ways by many people. And of course, it's a scary word. It's kind of the maximum risk you can imagine. People apply it to all kinds of things, and they don't always really mean that, in the sense that human extinction is a really high bar. There are lots of definitions of existential risk floating around. This is one. Our colleagues at Rand Corporation, a couple of whom are here today, have produced a really great report called Global Catastrophic Risk Assessment for the government. And they have their own discussion of that and definitions of it, and there are many others. But global catastrophe of 1 billion people dying, an even worse risk if many more people were to die or something like a nuclear war were to happen, loss of population, armed conflict, loss of long-distance trade, loss of government. Those are the sorts of things that people working in this area typically think about. So this is a study from 2023 of a US-Russia exchange of basically their entire deployed arsenals of 4,000 total 100 kiloton nuclear weapons, and the ensuing nuclear winter with a lot of smoke injected into the stratosphere. And this group estimated that most of the deaths would come from the aftermath of the war, not the war itself. And the dark areas at the top of this map are areas where they predict famine would ensue and people in those areas would mostly starve. There's also, of course, what we are witnessing right now, the rise of authoritarian governments and far-right parties. This has happened all over Europe, and many European countries are kind of on a knife edge between a far-right, which is not as extreme as ours, and slightly more centrist governments. In Brazil, there was an insurrection as there was here in 2023. South Korea had a similar kind of event. So these are real risks, and one thing that tends to come along with them is the de-governance of things that were once better governed. So I work on climate science and climate change issues, planetary boundaries issues, And we're seeing with our own administration the withdrawal again from the Paris Agreement. This time will happen faster and last longer than it did the first time, when it actually was only in effect for about 3 or 4 months before the 2020 election. So in this scenario, things like the progress that has been made on fossil fuels gets reversed. Drill, baby, drill. We will expand the use of fossil fuels, and suddenly the risk of a higher temperature increase is greater than it was just 3 months ago. Another feature of governments like that, and something that happens kind of organically anyway in many situations, is what people in STS call agnotology, the science or study of ignorance. And there are a couple of forms of this. Now, one is deliberate production of ignorance through secrecy or destroying things like data and denialism. There's also the phenomenon of active dismantling of well-established knowledge infrastructures. So those include expertise, personnel, instruments, and facilities. And of course, we're seeing this across the board with science agencies and environment agencies, and the reduction in funding for research. Also, the government's scrubbing of the phrase climate change from most of its websites. So I'll stop by just saying that some of the risks that we're facing are not just material risks, but also epistemic risks, risks that we will not know enough to stop our own destruction. So I have several examples here. One is that climate change and planetary boundaries, people sometimes don't talk about the intersecting risks, the cascades of risks that would ensue from extreme climate change, such as tipping point effects. There's the land carbon sink that failed in last year, essentially absorbed very little carbon. That effect is not taken into account in a lot of climate models. Tipping points are poorly modeled, so we need to know things about that, and now we're retreating from an aggressive research program in climate science. There's the push now for a return to live testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, because there was a knowledge infrastructure in place for that when we did testing underground, and it involved things like drilling, sensors underground, expertise about how to measure underground blasts, and so on. All of that essentially disappeared after the turn to use of simulation instead of live testing in the 1990s. And I talked already about authoritarian governments undermining or destroying knowledge infrastructures. For us, many of us are scholars. We are concerned about the lack of attention to existential risks across boundaries. So there's a whole cadre of people who study nuclear war, but how will that interact with climate change, either with or without a war? How will it interact with artificial intelligence as a command control system, as a disinformation system, et cetera, et cetera? So we're partly here to encourage you to cross those boundaries, think about interacting risks, and work with us to help solve them. So I will stop here and introduce Dan Zimmer, Dr. Dan Zimmer, who will lead the first panel today.